So the psychology unit. Now, the psychology module itself is really interesting, and a lot of you are fascinated by it. So let's get right to it. Here we go. Psychology unit. Right to the beginning there. Wait, let's go right back to the first page. All right, so psychology. Psychology itself is quite interesting because you have quite a few people who kind of try to use psychology and use what I like to call psychobabble. And psychobabble really is just that thing that it's almost like a fake psychology or pseudo-psychology where they'll literally pick on anything. I mean anything, and try to create some kind of a problem with it, or a psychological history, or find something that might be wrong, quote unquote, with people. And so I'm going to give you a psychoanalysis, a self-test, if you will, and there are literally thousands out there. So I'm going to give you one, and we're going to work through this together, and hopefully you'll kind of get a feel for how you can psychoanalyze yourself. So here we go. So take out a piece of paper and pen or a pencil, and answer the questions. And I think that's a lot of these tests. And there's a test out there called the Rorschach test, which is the ink blot test, right, where the person will hold up the ink blots, and first thing that comes to your mind, word association, same thing. I'm going to say a word, then you say the first word that comes to your mind. So when you see the question, immediately, like, what your first instinct is, what's the first thing that comes to your mind, bam, that should be your answer. If you take a lot of time to think about it, it becomes contrived, and therefore it's not very honest. So question number one, you're not alone, you're walking in the woods. Who are you walking with? Go. Okay, so you've got a person that you're walking with in the woods. Next question. You're walking in the woods and you see an animal. What kind of animal is it? And again, you should have this answer right in your head, whatever it is, just write it down and go. So what interaction takes place between you and the animal? So what happens between you and the animal? Okay, next question. You walk deeper into the woods and you enter a clearing. And before you is your dream house. Describe the size of the house. Okay, jotted it down. Number 5, is your dream house surrounded by a fence? This one's yes or no. Okay, question 6. You enter the house and you walk into the dining area and see a dining room table. Describe what you see on and around the table. So what's in the dining room? What's around the table and what's on the table? Okay, remember, you have to be fast with these answers because you really want to get the feel for psychoanalysis. Okay, so you exit the house through the back door. Lying on the grass is a cup. What is the cup made out of? Or what material is the cup made out of? Okay, moving on to the next question. Getting close to the end. What do you do with the cup? So you find this cup in the backyard. What are you going to do with it? Okay, again, answer as fast as you can. Don't think too long, too hard, because it's supposed to be true psychoanalysis. So you walk to the edge of the property where you find yourself standing at the edge of a body of water. What type of body of water is it? So what is that body of water, whatever it is in your head? And then last question, how will you cross that water? So you see the water there, you've determined what kind of body of water it is, and you're going to say, okay, I need to cross that body of water. What is that way to cross it? Okay, quiz is over. Let's go through the interpretation. So question 1, the person you're walking with is the most important person in your life. So whoever you said for question 1 or you wrote down, that's the most important. Number 2 is the size of the animal is representative of the perception of the size of your problem. So you're walking through the woods and you see a bear, then your problems are so. You see a squirrel, your problems aren't that big. The severity of your interaction with the animal is representative of how you deal with your problems. So, you see a bear, you run away. You see a squirrel, you just kind of stare at it. You see a dog, you pet it. And so how you deal with your problems is how you represent the animal. Now you're starting to get a feel for how this works, right? So psychology in itself is very allegorical. It's very metaphorical. It's all about the ideas in your head, and how can we, without cluing you to what we're asking, How can we get you to instinctively respond to what goes on? And that's part of psychology is instinctive responses. So when you show the ink blot, you see two butterflies, or you see a bear eating a butterfly, or you see next ink blot and you see your mother squashing a bug, whatever the case may be. But it's always like, what do you see? Bam. What do you see? Bam. What do I say the word dog, you say cat. I say water, you say drink. I say caviar, you say crackers. I don't know, whatever comes to mind. As a psychoanalyst, I would take all of these answers and then start to really figure out what's going on in your head. The size of your dream house is representative of the size of your ambition to resolve your problems. If you have a fence around your house, it means you're a very closed personality. But if you have no fence around your house, it means you're a very open personality. If you answer in 6 for what's on the dining room table or around the dining room table, if you didn't put any food or people or anything else in the dining room, it means you're generally unhappy. Going to number 7, the material that your cup is made out of is a representative of how your relationships are. So if your cup is paper or styrofoam, then all of those disposable types of cups would mean that your relationships are also disposable, especially with that person that you picked in number 1. If it's a very strong material, then your relationship with person number 1 is very strong. Your disposition for the cup is, what are you going to do with that cup? That was a question. You find the cup, what are you going to do with it? You leave it in the grass, or you pick it up and you throw it in the garbage, or you take it with you. Your disposition for what you do with that cup is a representation of your attitude towards the person number 1. So are they disposable? Are they someone that you keep with you? That's the kind of thing. The size of the body of water in your backyard when you walk out of the house is the size or the representation of your desire for a relationship. So if there's a pond in your backyard, you're not interested in a relationship. Or if there's like a little creek, you're not really thrilled about getting into a relationship. But if it's an ocean, then it's something that's like massive and it's big and it's so important to you. How wet you get crossing that massive body or small body of water is indicative of the importance of the relationship to you. So the more wet you get, the more important the relationship is. Now, that's a 10-question psychoanalytical interpretation of what's going on in your head. Now, having said that, it's bogus. There was no merit whatsoever in what I said. So now you're like, what? Why would you do that to me, G? And the reason why I'm doing that to you is to kind of demonstrate to you that you could literally take anything and turn it into some kind of psychoanalytical, what's the word I'm looking for? Dissection of someone's mind, right? And someone can create these tests and they can throw them out there. And I kid you not, students who are listening to this lecture, the world is full. I mean, Facebook is full of these things, magazines are full of these things. The internet is riddled with these personality tests and different tests, and you really, really have to be careful because they could pass them off as being, quite academic and quite legitimate, and when in actual fact, it's just they really could be nothing more than a joke. So be very wary of these things. And so that's why I kind of brought the test like the ink blot test, right? Where the ink blot test has been almost one of the standards that was being used for quite some time in psychology, where someone would be sitting with a psychoanalyst or a psychotherapist or a psychologist or psychiatrist, and they're sitting down and the person is holding up these different kinds of ink blots, and the person's reaction or response or what they see in the ink blots would be an indication of what's going on in their head. Same thing with word association or free association, where the psychoanalyst or the psychotherapist or the person sitting across from you says, I'm going to say like a whole bunch of words, and I want you to give me like the first word that comes into your mind. And the first word that comes to your mind, they write it down, and then they create a kind of like a psychological profile of what's going on or what they think might be going on in your head. Now, that's not to say that just because, when they say dog, you say cat, when they say black, you say white, that, you're a person who's into conflict, right? Because they say one thing, you say the opposite. They say yes, you say no. They say up, you say down. That's just sometimes just a reactionary thing. And so don't always assume that just because you give that answer or that answer is given, that that's exactly what's going on in the person's head. The mind is so complex, and I think this unit will really highlight to you how complex the brain and the mind and the process that goes on, or the processes that go on in the brain, really are. So let's get to that right here. So psychology is the scientific. Here it is, right in front of you. But it's basically the thing that goes on in your head. As far as being an ology or a study, it is relatively new. If you look, it says it's existed since the late 1800s. So let's say 1870, 1880, 1890. Well, that would have meant that in 1970 or 1980 or 1990, psychology was 100 years old, which then brings us to where we are now. The study of the brain and the mind is not more than 150 years old. If we go as far back as we go back. So then the question becomes, how reliable is it? Because most of the other studies that we've covered have gone back much further. Some people say, well, it's relatively new in the field of medicine, and other people will say, yeah, 150 years is pretty good. That's enough time to gather data and to see where the brain is working. I think that as we grow and as we start to study more, it becomes more evident, especially as we start to be able to image the brain and truly understand what goes on in the brain. We are advancing our knowledge of psychology. But that doesn't mean that it's by any means perfect, because neurologists and psychologists and people who study the brain and the mind, or the inner workings of the brain, will often say there's no textbook case. Much like medicine, there is no textbook case. I mean, yes, the majority of the population may present one way, but that doesn't mean that it's the same for everybody. So the mental processes that we will cover in this unit are things like sensation, perception, learning, memory, and thought. Now, quickly, I'll break these down for you. Sensation is basically what your senses bring in. So hear, feel, see, touch, smell, taste. And how that really works is quite fascinating. I mean, it's amazing when you think of what happens when you feel something. So you put your hand down on the desk, right, or on the table in front of you, and you're like, okay, it's smooth, but it's kind of grainy, and it's kind of cold, it's warm. Well, the minute you put your hand there, the sensation that's triggered by the nerve endings in your hands, or the palm of your hand, fires up through the nerves in your arms, into your shoulders, into your spine, up to your brain. And the brain takes this impulse, this information that is being sent by the hand in a matter of microseconds, and processes it. And it tells you what you're feeling. And this is happening like that. I just snapped my fingers, by the way, right? It's happening just that fast. And so the sensation is just that. Perception is pretty close to it, where you feel it and you're like, well, it's kind of cold and it's kind of grainy, and making the sense of the sensation is the perception. And it's with touch it's pretty straightforward, but with things like smell and taste and vision, that can be relatively subjective. And what I mean by that is that I taste my coffee and I'm like, that's good coffee, and someone tastes the exact same cup of coffee and goes like, that's terrible coffee, right? The sensation is the same, it's coffee, but the perception is quite different, in the sense that I taste it differently than you would taste it. I see something differently than you would see it, simply because that's a perception. Which brings us to the next part of learning, right? And so I taste coffee and it tastes terrible. The sensation is that it's a warm or it's a hot liquid. The perception is like, it's kind of bitter. It has a really bizarre taste to it. The learning then becomes oh God, I'm really not a big fan of coffee, so I don't know how I feel about that. The memory part is the next part, where you're like, it's note to self, don't ever drink coffee again, tastes terrible, right? And then the thought part is the part that afterwards, like, well, maybe it was just that coffee, and not all coffee tastes that bad, so I need to really think about it, and maybe I'll try a different coffee later on. So, look at the picture. What do you see? Let's go right to the perception. So you're looking at the picture. Now, some of you will see a young woman looking away, and some of you will see an old woman looking down. Now, what does that say about you? Well, if we want to go back to the first thing that I talked about, was that initial psychoanalysis test. We'll say, okay, so what are you seeing? You see a young woman. Well, that says a lot about you. You see the old woman, oh, that definitely says a lot about you, right? And I mean, I could come across and say, well, that's what this means and that's what that means. That would be bogus. I'd be totally lying. But somebody comes along wearing a lab coat and wearing glasses with like a clipboard and pocket protector and calls himself Doctor Blah Blah Blah, or calls himself Doctor Blah Blah Blah, who's a psychoanalyst, will say, well, if you see the young woman looking away, then that means you're young at heart, but you also have relationship issues. And you're like, oh yeah, no, that's totally true. I am young at heart and I have relationship issues. Like, yeah, but if you see the old woman looking down first, then that must mean that you have an old soul and that you're very mature in the way you think, but you also have a really, really hard time of seeing the positive things. You always see the negativity and blah, blah, blah. And people go, yeah, no, that's so true. I did see the old woman, and she kind of has like a negative look on her face. Okay, so let me point her out to you. You're probably staring at the picture going, I don't see it. So here we go. The young woman, this is her hair, this is her eye, this is her nose, this is her cheek, this is her jaw line, this is her ear, and she's looking in that direction. And this is her hat. This is a funky hood, I'm guessing. If you see the old woman, this is kind of like a scarf, I guess. Her hair is in. This is her, I don't know why she has black hair. And then this would be her eye. This is her other eye. This is her nose. This is her mouth. This is her chin. And she's wearing some kind of a fur coat. Now, if you didn't see the old woman in the beginning and I just pointed her out to you, you're like, oh, now I see it. Or if you saw the old woman first and then I pointed out to you the young woman, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, now I see it. That says a lot. That says a lot about perception, right? Because you all saw the same thing, but not everyone saw the same thing. So psychology itself, once upon a time, was called philosophy. And for those of you that have studied philosophy, there are quite a few psychological aspects to it. But for those of you that haven't, it's been around since the ancient Greeks and even before that. But the ancient Greeks were the ones who kind of came up with this idea of the fluids in your body determine your personality. So you've got these things called humors, and you have things like bile. And too much bile would make you a very angry person. And if you have too much phlegm, then phlegm makes you a very sickly person. And again, maybe they didn't quite know, and maybe it seems a little far-fetched and unreasonable to say that, well, you've got 4 fluids in your body and the balance isn't quite there, so that makes you a little crazy or not crazy, quote unquote. And I would say that they probably had an idea of what's going on, they just didn't quite have the right idea. But hindsight being what it is, looking back 1,000+ years, you're like, well, they didn't have the technology that we have today, and we clearly know that it's not just a matter of how much bile you have in your system, but other things. So Hippocrates, also the guy who came up with this thing called the Hippocratic Oath, and for those of you moving on to be doctors, will take this oath, which is, do no harm, help your patients, do the best that you can. And he was one of the guys who said that the brain is responsible for your emotions, and it's not your heart that's responsible for your emotions. And you're like, well, obviously I knew that. But the Egyptians felt the same way. The Egyptians didn't feel that the brain was important. In fact, the ancient Egyptians, when somebody who was really important was mummified, they would actually remove the brain during the mummification process. And they would keep organs in these things called canopic jars and have them buried with the deceased. And they would often be like the liver and the stomach and the heart, the lungs, these were the important organs. And for the ancients, the brain was not nearly as important, and the heart, would have been far more important than the brain. And it's funny because you're like, well, yeah, we know that. However, I will say this, that it's still carried forward, even to this day, where, when you love somebody, what's the emoticon or the emoji or just the symbol, for that matter, that people use to show love? It's the heart. And it's funny because there's nothing, I mean absolutely nothing to do with your heart. Your heart has no sense whatsoever of the feeling of love. That's purely in your brain. So we still use that kind of an analogy as, as the heart being the space the place where love comes from. And it's not. But back at the time when Hippocrates came along and said, you know what, it's the brain, not the heart. And people went, whoa, don't question us, because we know that the heart clearly is where all the love is. Later on, much later on, a guy by the name of John Locke came along and said that, your brain is much like a blank sheet of paper. You're born with a blank sheet of paper. And all of your experiences and everything that the brain receives is written on that blank piece of paper. And again, it's a metaphor, but the idea being, he called it the tabula rasa, or the blank slate. And he basically said that, the brain is what takes all of these experiences and all of the things that happen, and it records them, and that's what creates thinking. And in many ways, he was kind of right when he kind of said that the information that the brain receives, it processes, and it turns into learning and knowledge and so forth. And you yourselves are evident, or are evidence of this, where your experiences in the past or recent past will often influence your decisions and the way you think. So, fast forward to the 19th century, where a guy by the name of Sigmund Freud really, brought psychology to the forefront. And I'll do a Freud lecture later on. But in and around his time, people start to really take an interest in the brain and how the brain worked. And one of the earliest studies of the brain would have been phrenology. Now, you may or may not have seen these, where it is a little statue of the human head. And as you can see here, each of these parts, people would actually go and see a phrenologist, and then again, we're talking about the 18th, 19th century, where someone would go and he would put his hands, and I say he because it was generally a man, would put his hands on people's heads and feel for the different bumps and ridges and flat spots on people's skulls and say, well, you got a flat spot over here on the lateral side of your brain. That must mean that, you're a criminal, right? And back here, it must mean you're a kleptomaniac because I see it's kind of flat on this side. And it's quite amazing to think that somebody could feel the skull, which is, not really connected to the brain in any way, shape, or form, but he would determine your personality based on the bumps on your head, because clearly the head is where the brain is, and I guess they were kind of starting to get close to the idea of the brain being the organ that thinks, but not quite there yet. So that was phrenology. Okay, so let's look at the different theories or branches of psychology. All right, so sorry. I'm drinking my coffee here while I'm talking to you. So there are different theories and different branches of psychology, because if you look at psychology from the outside, it's just the same study. But like anthropology, psychology is very much a branch kind of a study, in that each of the branches has its own take on how the brain works or how human behavior is generated in the mind. So that pretty much says what I just said. So the biology. Now, if you're biologically looking at the brain, which you probably shouldn't because it's in somebody's skull, and for you to look at the brain would be quite violent to open up somebody's head. But the biological view of the brain is that the brain itself is a biochemical process, and the thinking that happens, or the mental processes that happen in the brain, are in fact nothing more than a physiological process of impulses and a biochemical or electrical impulses traveling back and forth from the brain through the nerves. And what you see happening in there and inside the brain is purely on a biological level. So everything that you see, hear, feel, touch, experience, say, do, is all a result of biology, basically, but whatever happens in the brain. And my kids are awake, so I'm just going to quickly pause.